I am so glad that Nintendo fans did not delude themselves overall about the performance of the Nintendo Switch 2. I've seen some content creators and some fanboys that are making this error, and I've said there's just no need to bother with it because the frames will be counted. And this is not to, say anything about what's bad about the Nintendo Switch 2 in terms of graphics. I don't think anyone is actually expecting graphics from this particular hardware. It is what it is. In today's technological world, from a physics perspective, if you notice how they cool high powered rendering devices, what I mean by that is GPUs, CPUs, and others, they have to use big blocks of cooling. A handheld that is flat around its build and such is already limited by the amount of heat and cooling, capabilities that it can manage within that build and framework. I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges that performance actually sees. In fact, if you watch overclocking videos, the second is power draw. So if you think about power draw, these devices are designed to be as power efficient as they possibly can within the price point. When you mix all of this together, it's almost impossible for you to be able to get a very efficient device for the price that you want today. Hopefully, in the next few years, technology will get old enough where this stuff starts to become cake. But for now, it's still kind of meaty at the end of the day. We're going to watch a little bit of Digital Foundry's coverage of Cyberpunk 2077 on the Nintendo Switch 2. Kick back, relax, let's jump right in, and I'll give my commentary as we go on. Thanks.
Nintendo's patents are kind of hinting about. Alex, now you have got access to the press quality asset for Cyberpunk 2077 from the Direct, and you spent some time looking at it in a bit more depth, right?
Right. And the basic thing I can say is that there are a lot of confounding factors looking at this footage to say, oh, yes, this is DLSS. And Rich already talked about one that we don't typically look at DLSS running at very low resolutions at 1080p. That's actually not the typical thing we look at on the channel. But even in spite of that, I've played games with low res 1080p DLSS before, just checking it out, and it's a lot harder in this footage as well too to figure out what's going on visually due to a lot of other aspects of the visuals in Cyberpunk on Switch 2 as of this press trailer footage at least is done at like sub native and sub internal res too. You can see that there's the one part where they're showing that like walkway along the edge in, I think it's called Dogtown area. They're showing it like a
By the way,
sunny type of day.
I think this is okay. I really do think that what I'm seeing here is actually okay, right? I'm not gonna have to, zoom in and such. If I was playing on a handheld, I wouldn't really have the patience to be doing that. So I'm happy that we're getting to this point in handheld performance. In fact, I think they're the ones that need the upscaling more than anything because they're all kind of joined together. While in the dedicated hardware space, we ought to be looking at raw power and better efficiency when it comes down to it.
There, and if you look at the particles on what looks like a crashed container ship in the background, you can see they have like massive alias blocks in them that are, quite literally, Super Nintendo styled. So
Wow.
they're doing things like lower res particle effects. That's a pretty common thing to do in games, as well as things like motion blur and depth of field are also quite a lot lower resolution than the internal like normal rasterized G-buffer resolution. And as a result of that, a lot of those edges actually show up in the footage constantly, and they obscure the edges that DLSS is producing. So when I look for a DLSS edge in a game, DLSS actually doesn't produce normal aliased edges almost ever. What it does do is it'll take that aliased edge and it'll like try and fix it up almost like FXAA would, but it does it in this like wavy line type of way. The CNN
Okay,
model did at
so
least.
there, the technology is actually getting the job done, in a sense.
And here, due to all those compounding factors, as well as the slow moving camera in a lot of scenes, it's pretty hard to find any of those lines. But one thing, as I can say, there's a point when there, there's like a procession, at there's like these like Asiatic lamps, and there's like the goldfish in the background. That's a hologram. I forget exactly which area of Cyberpunk this is in, but there's these like the lamps there, between these poles, etc. The poles there, they do have actually that kind of wobbly edge that I expect from DLSS.
Now, you got to understand that this game was launched on the PlayStation 4, right? And that hardware doesn't have access to these kinds of technologies that will compensate for them. That's what the PS4 basically lacks. If somebody could come up with, say, a solution within their own internal engines that can get the job done, the PlayStation 4 still remains a viable piece of hardware to launch your games on.
But the rest of the footage, it's harder to find those kind of edges. For example, when the character's moving along there on the motorbike at the one section, a lot of those edges there would typically have that kind of bug in them. But here, due to the extremely low quality motion blur that is on, it's actually obscuring all those edges pretty much all the time. And instead, you're getting full aliased edges, which is not what you'd get with DLSS. Another thing to say is that there are a couple moments where I can say at least this isn't FSR2, because when characters move their arms, you don't get the typical disocclusion fizzle, which is something, you could technically not have that with TAA. But that would be another thing that points to, this footage here is using DLSS in that aspect. But a lot of the other things that I would usually expect to see from DLSS here, CNN model, I'm also not seeing.
And it's probably a DLSS specification that's designed for the hardware.
For example, any of the other visual bugs that it can cause occasionally. But that's probably down to the lack of variety in the footage and just how fast this footage is. So.
Right. Yeah, fair enough. It's interesting that you're talking about the post-processing being of a lower resolution, because typically with DLSS, it's rendered at native resolution, native output resolution, those effects, right? Yeah. That's why DLSS, it's not actually always upscaling from a lower native resolution.
Oh, I didn't know that. I thought DLSS used the majority of it was upscaled.
That will just look poor if you upscale them, and we've got the reverse here. They're actually of a lower resolution. The resolution isn't going up for that post-processing; it's going down, which is of course a time-honored bandwidth-saving trick.
Let's fast forward to this point here.
All 1080p except for the handheld performance mode, which is targeting 720p 40. That's quite interesting. However, is it actually 1080p and 720p, or is DRS in play, as we saw from the footage? And the answer is that, yes, DRS is in play quite obviously.
So they're scaling it dynamically then. So as I said previously, Cyberpunk 2077 Ultimate Edition on Nintendo Switch 2 is currently targeting 1080p resolution in all modes except handheld mode, where we're targeting 720p resolution. Scaling can range from 2x and up per axis.
They don't want to go into specifics here, except they did say that scaling can range from 2x and up per axis, which effectively confirms that it's going to be a 540p to 1080p range for those 1080p modes, and it'll be like 360p to 720p on that 720p 40
so
handheld.
These developers can optimize their games to do whatever it is that they wanted to do. Why have they been acting like this all this while, as if to say, just buy our game at poor performance and then we're going to fix it later on when we have an incentive or not to fix it? I think the Nintendo Switch 2 is going to expose a lot here, and this is going to be very interesting to watch at the end of the day how this all plays out.
Yeah, so interesting new data there. Kind of explains how an ambitious game like this is going to be running on, such a resource-constrained device. Interesting stuff.
That's the way they got to do it.
But you highlighted some footage from one of the hands-on sort of videos that you saw on YouTube.
Yes.
Kind of highlights that, yeah.
Yeah, someone, again, Nintendo has these various capture requirements that require you to be so far away from the screen.
They require you to be far from the screen because they don't want their consumers to know if they're actually interested in that stuff. That's obvious.
a pretty dead-on shot of the screen. I don't know how they were able to do that. Maybe they cropped in a high-res video or something. But in any case, they
8K,
have this, they have this like super tight crop of the handheld screen. They're playing Cyberpunk. They're playing some interior areas, and you're seeing a lot of breakup there. It's not super clean like you might expect with DLSS sometimes. So that threw me a little bit for a bit of a ride, and I'm like, that doesn't. Does that
Those
look like
animations
DLSS?
are compressed as heck. See how fast that guy ran?
So maybe not. But again, Alex has pointed out the low-res post-processing, which makes a lot of sense here in terms of giving you a more compromised final visual result. That's obviously not what NVIDIA advises, but when you have such a low-power handheld here, maybe that's the only route you can reasonably go in order to get DLSS working at a performant level. But unfortunately, that does mean compromising image quality. I remember the compromised post-processing resolution in a title like Alan Wake 2 kind of destroyed image quality on consoles using FSR2 upscale.
I mean, what do you expect, right? What do you expect from this kind of a device? This is what you're going to get at the end of the day, and there's no amount of upscaling that you want to do. The rendering is going to also depend on the hardware itself, and that's where I think a lot of things come into play with this particular Nintendo Switch thing. This is why I said, and I'm glad many Nintendo fans did not take that bait about performance talk and so on and so forth. Just a waste of time more than anything else. I'm glad that many people just looked and said, we're going to move away from this conversation, because that's not what Nintendo consoles are about. But again, too, though, you got to think about the other handhelds that are able to do good performance and better performance. And now when people see their price point and see what it is that they cost to actually do, maybe they can probably put a little bit more respect on the names of these devices, if you get what I mean. All right, that's it for me. Talk to me in the comment section. Thanks so much for watching the video. Appreciate you guys' time and audience. Talk to me in the comment section. Peace out.